Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Explicit Measures Podcast with Tommy, Seth, and Mike. Good morning, everyone. How's it going? How's everyone doing this fine Thursday morning?
Good morning, Mike.
Good morning, Mike. I'm doing excellent.
I did a bad thing yesterday.
Uh-oh.
I ate espresso ice cream after dinner, and I was up all night.
Oh, no.
It affects me more and more now, man. This morning I woke up, I'm like, I'm so tired. I'm not sure why I could go to sleep last night. And then my wife, Kelly, she goes, oh, I think I put two and two together. Last night we had espresso-based ice cream. I'm like, oh, no wonder it tasted so good. And I was like,
it was so tasty.
Hypering around the house last night, getting stuff cleaned and done. And no wonder I was riding the espresso high. So anyways, with that...
We've been riding our dog got spayed this week high, which means she's literally up all night. Early mornings. It's a good time. It's a good time. Let me tell you. It reminds me probably of what Tommy's life is like right now. Because Tommy, you have real young ones, don't you?
I got three pretty much under 5.
Under 5, yeah. See,
yeah.
Wait.
It
3 under
reminds
5?
Me of like the infant stage, man.
Yeah.
Where it's just like, what? Like, okay. The phase.
While they're not directly comparable, it is like having another person to take care of at your house. A dog, it needs a lot of extra support in those early months.
In the young years,
yes.
You betcha. Or, months. That's a good one, right? Yeah. Let's go with months rather than years.
Let's something on the slower end.
Children with.
Yes, exactly.
The dog, yeah.
Well, I don't care how much I haven't been sleeping because of children, because finally, if you've checked your metrics this morning in Power BI, which I was very excited to see, Mike's biggest pet peeve with goals, and I can't use it because it's really missing the most essential feature, so therefore forget all of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Is gone. Or the
biggest
entry is
the biggest
gone.
pet peeve is gone. Right.
The biggest pet peeve is gone.
This makes so much more sense.
My
Dude,
goodness.
I'm all in. I'm all in.
Okay, so Tommy, you shared me this morning a little diagram, and so, well, let's first, Tommy, talk about the feature. Like, what did they do that makes this better?
So the simplest thing is it doesn't require any configuration from the user end.
Yep.
It's finally tracking the target on the same visual as it is the current. And whether or not it's a dynamic measure or connection, or if it's something static. So you can see, okay, we were, we're ahead of schedule, but a month ago we were behind.
Yeah.
And you can see that line by line. The really cool thing that I also noticed is a lot of people don't know this, but you can set the goals basically cycle. Not necessarily when it refreshes, but basically how many times it's going to check the target. So it basically adds these indicators. If you have a daily, then obviously a daily indicator, but a lot of them it's a weekly or a monthly.
Yeah.
And it basically puts in just basically a marker per your cycle, which is phenomenal. So finally, and this is all historical, it's not like it starts today. So all of your scorecards
captured it from.
So as long as you've been tracking it. So this also tells me this.
Well done. Yeah. Well done. Whoever released that feature into the mix here.
And that's where I was kind of going with that feature. I'm looking at it going, my gosh, Tommy, you've been tracking these goals all along. Well, it's just the data apparently the data has been there, and every time they're storing a record of data, they've had it there. They're just now able to show it to you. So that was kind of a nice feature to have it just show up. Now I'm looking for the blog on this. I'm not seeing anything specifically on the blog. Did you just realize? Did this just show up for you, or is this something they've announced?
It really just showed up for me. I know it was on the roadmap.
So it's like the diehards of goals now / metrics, right? Get the benefit right out of the box.
Yes.
Right.
And Tommy, I appreciate the fact that I think your posts went out at real early this morning or late last night, pinging. Yeah. I love the digs,
you're right.
Like when new features come out, we can dig each other. Oh, hey, now you got no excuse to use it. Relax. That was Mike. I'm
Right.
all on board, man.
I just thought you would like to know too. So, and honestly, you combine this with what they've been talking about Viva goals.
Which
I haven't
looks
There's a
stuck with
lot.
that yet.
which looks
Have you looked into
shockingly
that?
similar.
Have you looked into the config? Like, I assume that's just an app to set goals, right?
No, they are
No.
going all in. So if you actually go to the
Oh,
Viva Goals
yeah.
website, they basically have on that adoption site that they have,
Yeah.
they not only have said we're going to introduce this feature, but they have a 65-page PDF that's not necessarily technical about OKRs, the
Mhm.
methodology. I mean, they don't even have the tool
Okay.
out there yet. They're just trying to prep people for that way of thinking, which is what
Yeah.
we've always said.
Mm.
You can have a tool, but if people are not thinking in the right way and you don't have the right culture, it doesn't matter.
Right.
So
Things
they're
just got
going
serious on my
all
end.
in.
I'm getting engaged. Here we go.
I dig
So
it.
I am super excited.
I think that's a very I think it is a very well-rounded portion of the future, and it's actually very. I think it's very exciting to me to see them building goals, and then seeing what looks like, or at least the style, appearing to be everywhere else. Right? You're seeing that the Viva. What were they calling it? Viva goals? No, they're calling it Viva something else.
Viva Goals.
So it's Viva goals.
So
and
they
then
rename
metrics and
goals
RPI.
to metrics, and then call Viva goals. That seems silly. Just leave it goals, people. Oh well. We
Here,
don't
I'll
control.
send the
We don't
PDF.
control the naming.
So this is really, really interesting. But I think what they're doing with metrics right now, we're keep going on that right path in terms of we can't. If you thought you got into data just because you really like numbers, you are in for a terrible treat because
It's terrible.
there's a lot more
Terrible.
you have
Oh,
to
you mean
do.
like a good treat?
Well,
You're
there's a
in
lot more
for
you
a
have to think
wild
about.
ride.
Yeah.
That's it. That's what we were looking for.
So I'm really excited about that. But yeah, so if you guys have not checked out the metrics now in Power BI, there's really not a lot of reasons why you shouldn't be utilizing this.
All right. Well, I got to dig in now. One more new thing I got to learn.
This one's easy. So easier than some of the other things you got to learn.
Yeah, like filter context.
Yeah. Or embedding.
At least it's not like that. Any other good articles or things that have come across the interwebs that we should discuss or catch up on? I didn't really take it. I've been kind of heads down this week, so I haven't had a whole bunch of time to spend on LinkedIn or Twitter looking for things. I didn't see anything that really stuck out to me yet.
The only other thing is that more stuff on data marts. I think it was data dash mark or who runs that website? Data Mark and Data Mark.
Mark Lowfield, isn't
Mark,
it?
yeah. So he has some really good tidbits about utilizing data marks with composite models.
Oh,
And
interesting.
just like if you have the issues where like data is not showing up, you have to create the relationships between them. So
Okay.
some good tidbits there. I just put that in a link too. So more people keep talking about data marks.
Oh, I think I think this is not going away anytime soon. Again, this is one of these features that I think is such a large development of work that people are still to figure out how to work with it correctly. And it's very early in the stages, so it'll be neat to see. Will this be another moment like we had when we saw like originally Power BI come out? Right? Will this be like another key moment where we sit back and say, "Oh my gosh," looking back a couple of years and saying, "I remember when data marts came out, we were so skeptical and didn't have all the features and all this stuff." So it's going to continue to be enhanced.
Yeah, just give it a couple more years, just like when we were talking about the Power BI designer.
Oh yeah,
ages us even further, right?
Jeez,
you were around when data marts came out, man. That's crazy.
What did you do before that?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's a great transition.
100%.
Yeah, it is actually. Man, it's almost like we're good at this.
Like we knew what topic we were talking about today.
We knew what we were going to talk about. Yeah.
So with that transition, topic for today, and Tommy gave me here's the proper title. Tommy gives me the proper title, and I had like, Tommy, there's no way that's even going to fit in a description inside YouTube. But so the title is the Power Platform better than our classic Microsoft BI architecture? What is that, comparatively? What are we seeing now? And so it's really classic architecture versus modern platform. What are the key differences maybe that we see? What are the key areas that we see Microsoft changing here? So yeah, I think this is a really good topic. So I guess we should define kind of both areas first. What are we saying is classic Microsoft BI architecture, and then we should just kind of maybe outline a little bit, maybe by contrast, what is the Power Platform or Power BI architecture looking like? I'll kick this
Well, I
one
think
off to. Oh, go ahead, Seth.
no, I just want to give this one comes, I think, from Tommy, you picking up something off
Oh
LinkedIn
yeah,
with
Yeah,
Marcus
just
Wegener,
yep.
right? Where
I'll throw
he
the
was
article in the post there.
kind of reminiscing more so than anything in terms of like a direct comparison between old school versus new school,
Yep.
right? So I'm interested because this is a nostalgic conversation, or it will be to some degree. But he was, kind of reminiscing and thinking about like, have you ever thought about what are the comparable components, right, between classic Microsoft BI and Power BI,
Yeah.
right? So we I think spend a lot of time talking about cloud, big data things, but I think in this realm, pretty sure Tommy, the goal here is to kind of talk about previous or currently used tools for BI and the benefits of the Power BI ecosystem compared to what we had.
Yeah, I think for the sake of the conversation, there's obviously compared to 10 years ago, quite a bit more ability to do ETL data modeling, obviously with the introduction of Amazon, obviously Azure Stack. But the very intriguing part of the post by Marcus Wagner and his visual that he did was it's really just comparing Microsoft's full stack 10 years ago for BI architecture
Hmm?
compared with honestly just the business users architecture or their stack now. So basically, for those who cannot see, it basically he went through like what was ingesting data, storing, modeling, and then serving it
Yeah. So
back in the day. Yeah.
he breaks it down to kind of like three key areas, right? You have this source, right? Where does the data come from? And then you have ETL, extract, transform, loading. Then you have this concept of the data warehouse. Then you have the semantic model, applying schema relationships to tables potentially. And then the finally is what is the output of the report? What does that look like? So yeah, I think he has a great little diagram in there that looks really good. I love it. See how it's kind of changed over the years. So let's define classic architecture. What do you guys put in the bucket or the realm of classic BI architecture for Microsoft? How do you perceive that?
I don't think it's really a perception, and he pretty much laid that laid out.
Well,
I think cla- if I'm gonna state like what is the most significant difference between classic and new architecture
hmm?
is it's accessible now to all, as opposed to classic is you had to be in IT to be touching these tools or have access to like do this stuff.
So previously, I guess it would be way more code based is how I would see it, right? It's so in his diagram that he points out, it's a lot of SQL Server, right? It's all SQL Server all the way
Yeah.
through, right? So it's
Right.
how do I get data into that SQL Server? That's where we live most of the time, and so your store procedures are bringing things to that SQL Server. Your views on top of that SQL Server, that's applying more of your meta layer, right? So how do you stitch tables together into a view? Um, with that became a lot of technical debt around DBAs, right? Optimizing, indexing on keys and
Let's
columns and things like that. So there was
so
that
yeah.
was all code based,
Yeah,
right?
well, let's think about this, right? Like, so there were interfaces for all of this, right? But so you have a source production system,
Yep,
and since we're talking about Microsoft and all of us have Microsoft systems, are there other ones out there? Yeah, but we're talking about Microsoft, so it's SQL. It's always been SQL.
always been SQL.
So not only are the biggest differences between these two, like it's now accessible to a business user or anybody, right? But in the past, you had SQL Server integration services,
Yeah,
So
SSIS.
the
Mhm.
interface for that was cumbersome, right?
Vi- Visual Studio,
You
right?
had a UI that
Yeah.
you could engage with, but it was very prone to breaking with obscure errors, which is where if you've been in the technical space, have DBA experience, or are an old school SQL person, there's you're a very good troubleshooter. Let's put it that way,
Mhm.
because you track down error codes and figure out what broke, and it a myriad of different things that can go on not only within the programs but the machines themselves, but absolutely geared at developers with thick skins, right? Like,
Mhm.
we have to connect to data here, move it over here, and every finite point along the way, you were probably in a properties window, you were probably messing around with data types underneath the covers of what looked and appeared to be just this simple box that was going to process a bunch of data. um, so in terms of like the ingestion of a multi-layered tool, right, that could
Yep.
do a lot of different things, but was very difficult to just navigate and required a lot of time and technical know-how, um,
Mhm.
you know, in comparison to Power Query, it's night and day,
Yep. Totally
right?
agree with that.
So if we want to like elicit some of the Power Query components before we go on to the net new, we can.
No, and I guess maybe I have a couple more just keynotes or thoughts that I'm thinking about here. Like as you're discussing those things, these are things I think I've talked about in the past, but it's really kind of becoming, you know, solid in my mind at this point. Like there's a couple other things that are happening here, right? SSIS, SQL Server. When you bought BI previously, it was all contained into one machine, the storage and the compute layer. And so I think there's a shift happening here, or we're either in the middle of it or it's starting to occur for more people. I'm not really sure where it makes sense, but the SQL Server makes a lot of sense for asset transactions, right? You need very resilient tracking of those records and making sure that you don't lose data, high availability, but that compute and storage was all in one machine. I think the cloud has changed some of that. And I think there was a tipping point for me in my journey in figuring this out was the cloud became incredibly cheap to store things. So,
Mhm.
there's been, if you think about a SQL server for a company that's doing more legacy BI, they go buy a machine, they put it on prem, and they would spend the capital to acquire the cores, the compute on prem. It would stay there, and it was cheap for them because they had already purchased the machine. Compute was cheap. I've already paid for it. It's ready to go. Let's use it up like crazy. So the SQL Server made sense there. When you had to add storage space, and I remember having conversations with my BI team around, hey, we're running out of room on this whatever server. It was like lots of money to buy more hard drive space for this machine.
Yeah.
And so the expense to store the information was incredibly high. And because the storage cost wasn't higher, you found people optimizing like, okay, we're not going to keep every record. We're not going to keep every slowly changing dimension. We're going to have all these aggregations happening. And so, as you loaded things into your data warehouse, unless you had a very clearly planned design, okay, we're not going to store every piece of information because that's expensive for us. The business didn't see the need of keeping everything. Okay, now shift this to cloud comes into play here, and the cloud storage system is incredibly cheap. I think last time I did the calculation, you can store a gig for a year for 25 cents kind of thing, right? It's incredibly cheap to get space, and it's easy to scale up or scale down. So a blob storage container, you only get charged for what you use. You don't get charged for having the ability to use it, which is what you had to do on-prem. So that the shifting here changed from, all right, I'm going to optimize for storage, and now I'm going to optimize for compute, because now when you use the computing portion of the cloud, that's the part that's expensive. So the whole paradigm has shifted away from storage is expensive and compute is cheap to now storage is cheap and compute is expensive. And for me, that was like the pivotal moment when I started realizing this, thinking, oh wow, okay, this changes how I build stuff. So it's easier for me to pick up data, transform it, and store it back down as flat files and parquets or delta tables as opposed to doing other things. And that happens to various degrees in like data flows. So data flows brings up data, it stores it down as CSV files in a basically a blob storage account that's in the cloud. And you can then pick up that information and transform it over and over again using Power Query. So to me, a lot of this new modern technology changed because parts of the storage and compute became commodity based. So, anyways,
100%.
that's
Like
like how I
you
perceive it.
look at how fast the hardware changed,
Yeah.
right? Over the course of time.
Yep.
And the other components within here, versus classic MSBI was designed in systems that had like you had to maintain, you had an infrastructure team,
Yep.
you had, you know, DBAs to ensure that you had proper indexing and storage and like
Yeah.
all of the
Totally.
maintenance of that machine to make it work and perform at a high level.
Yep.
You had to have teams of people
Yeah. Special
to
training
do,
on that thing.
right?
Yeah.
So as those hardware, improvements to CPU speed, to memory,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden those things getting cheaper kind of like probably was one of the main drivers for organizations like Microsoft to be like, well, why don't we just like spool up all this thing
Yeah.
and now create this thing that is a service, right? And that was
Oh,
like
that's a good
for
point.
me the pivotal mental shift between that still happens today, right?
Yeah.
Between finance teams and where budgets get spent from cloud versus on-prem
Hmm.
is there's always maintenance. There's deterioration of your hardware.
Yes.
There's like you have to go through these cycles, and where you're sinking your dollars in, y- the comparison between these systems has to include the people, the time, all of the things that it takes to
The
maintain your own
process.
stuff,
I,
right?
I hear this common
For
theme again. The
and
people,
time
process,
and
and
time.
oh, okay, and time. Okay, we'll throw time
But
in there
but
too.
it's a time thing. Like
Sure.
and I think, to some degree,
Appended.
Chris
Okay.
Wagner made a comment here, right?
PPTT.
A, a significant difference even in any stage of this is in where we are now with Power BI, it takes you how long to create a pipeline in Power Query? You can connect to a data source, you can
Yeah.
transform it, you can do it 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Oh man, that didn't work out. Throw it out. I'll do that tomorrow again and refresh.
Yep.
Back in SSIS, man, it would take you hours to
Yes.
put together that pipeline. Then it would take hours to process, depending on how many,
Very
how much
true.
load or data that you needed. And you wouldn't like you'd go incrementally and figure out where all the issues and errors were. And then at the end of it, be like, oh man, if I had built it this way, right? So if you there's a dev cost in here,
Yeah.
right? That
Yeah.
has just exponentially been flushed with how fast we can build these things now.
So that's an interesting take or kind of an interesting look at it because obviously we're speaking about this is all positive. And what I challenge you guys to do,
There's nothing
or at
negative
least
about the
this
modern BI architecture, Tommy. This is why we have jobs.
yeah, right.
I'm just
But
kidding.
at least for the sake of for the yes, for the sake of this conversation, Marcus Wagner did not include Azure or any Azure services in
True.
that
I
visualization.
I will
He
agree.
was
And none of my
no
comments are geared towards
right.
that.
But I think that's just kind of almost insane to think about 10 years ago. That was the, in a sense, premium top solution, SSIS, analysis services, SSRS. Like that was high you can go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now even without even considering what Azure can do, what these cloud services can do, just in the someone can do in a sense for free right now
Mhm.
without any cost is all when to your point incrementally better with more abilities, but also again it's much more accessible. As I think about this, there's an interesting take where I think the biggest thing is when you are budgeted in anything, you're a lot more resourceful and you're probably a lot more intentional in what you're doing, which has I think led to now we've talked about this a good amount where data has been democratized, but it's also just been overflown. So if it took me 3 hours and I only had a limited budget to do transformations, well, I'm going to be very selective on what we're going to output. Now I can create 50
Yep.
queries in Power Query and test things. And now we're adding on data marts. Now we're adding on all these different data flows. How, how many reports are in your tenant? And we have this user, the business user can do all of the capabilities that someone could do 10 years ago in the premium, premium tool set. It's kind of led to probably more sloppiness and probably more in the
I would
sense of
100%
attention.
agree with that, right? So, there's Don will make a comment in the chat around data is data. It doesn't matter, what fancy tool you use, right? I,
Yeah.
I agree, right? If you've got well established platforms that have, you know, a ton of development has gone in, and SSIS and SQL is processing data on a daily basis, and there's no reason to change, right? But net new, I think the development of tools that we have now allow you to iterate faster and
Yes.
make better solutions than
Yes.
you used to be able to. But to your point, Tommy, because it's easier, there is absolutely the other side of this, which I think we talk about a lot in terms of like, okay, great, the business has all these capabilities, but there's certain things we want to enterprise. And
Mhm.
what we're meaning is there's a lot of garbage out there,
Yeah.
right? There's a lot of just inefficient, poorly designed ETL. Like it's the nature of having so many non-technical people work in spaces that they don't understand what they're
Right.
actually doing. And they don't need to, which is great, but at the same time there comes a threshold where now BI teams are having to manage the other way, where it's trying to optimize something that was built, as opposed to having a very clear approach of how we go and build something through these layers, because you had to build it through these layers.
Let's also talk about. I mean, man, this is really amazing. So, in the same way that I talked earlier about the compute being, the storage being commoditized, we're also seeing the tooling change. And Microsoft, I would say, is from observationally, Microsoft is really good at identifying. Hey, let's look at the big challenges. What is the challenge that everyone's having? Everyone goes to Excel and does all this transformation and moves data around and copy pasting everything all over Excel. Excel is the world's largest programming tool, and it is the world's largest, you know, data tool, BI tool. It is. It just is. So if you take that and they looked at that problem and said, how can we make you use more of it? How can we make this easier for users? They started giving away Power Query for free, right? They introduced a brand new tool that does most of the common tasks that you need to do for data transformation. And they started the tools. This is the part that boggles my mind. It's given away for free. And now, they had previously, it was like you have to buy Excel, but then you could get the Excel Power Query add-in for free. You just go download it, it works. And now you have this really rich ETLing tool inside your Excel documents. And then you see Power BI Designer comes out with, now Power BI Desktop. Now you get a full analysis services for free because you can download it and put it on your machine. The tooling is free. And then Power Query comes with it for free. To me, like, that whole thing is like, without that hurdle, if you had to pay for Power BI, that would have just slowed down the adoption that much more in the beginning. It's just, that's like,
Well,
to me, the linchpin.
but at the same time, like it's different. If you're kind of talking like, how do you reposition the sale of your solutions, right? Because upfront you had to buy all this stuff.
Yeah.
These were all licensed products
Correct.
that came out
SQL Server's
in,
licensed.
quarterly or
Yes.
half year
Yep.
releases of features. They were all engineer like clockwork. Finance knew that, like, here's how much you had to pay for hardware,
Yeah.
for these products, for
Yep.
these licenses. And while Power BI is free, right? It's utilizing your machine's
Correct.
compute.
You've
and
already
memory,
paid for it,
right?
essentially.
And when you scale, like, you're scaling into a much different type of pricing model, because all of your users are licensed,
Yes.
right? Like,
Yes.
you're spreading out the
The costs.
the cost across many.
Yep.
Versus, saying here's a one-time cost of X for running this stuff.
Yeah. And to me, that's where things get very interesting. And I like, I don't know, data is data, right? What I would say so when I talk to people about the modern BI architecture, people think, well, I got to throw out all these old methodologies around data warehousing and, how do we get data in? None of those, all the principles still apply. having good data and good structure of data, 100% still applies. None of that has changed. The only thing I see changing here is the tools and the availability of those tools has to your latter point, Tommy, that you're talking about here. Now that the tooling is better, cheaper, easier to use, easier to consume. I don't need to write lines of code. It says low code solutions. It's a trend. And all I see is this low code solutioning stuff accelerating, right? It's just everywhere you look, whether you're building like a website, you go to like WordPress, it's like low code, no code. If you're building things in the Power Platform, everything there is low code, no code. You can basically build everything almost by drag and drop now because the tooling is getting so good that the tooling enables a lot of your creation of things. And I think that just makes it more accessible to people. But the downside is you're going to get a lot more output. You're going to have a lot more to deal with. You have to figure out what is really good and what is really not good. So I think that's really, really interesting observation there.
I do like that point because one of the thoughts that I had as we got to this topic was that common data is data. It's always been data. Yes, but our relationship to data has changed dramatically, just even in the last 5 years, where it not necessarily was something that couldn't be reached, but it was much more we call it precious to get a hold of. If you've ever tried to build an SSRS report, you were really going to focus on those 2 or 3 visuals, and you wanted to make sure they're right the first time. Compared to now, where we can literally put 15 visuals on a page, get to the next one, do all these transformations. Our relationship to touching the data, especially as the developer with Power Apps as well, with Power Query, having that insight at any time, and like you said, it's free. I can do it in the cloud. I can do it on my computer. We're a lot more you could call it intimate with the data, but at the same time though, that again, there that kind of leaves a sloppiness. But the other part too is it makes us we have to change our skill set always. And
I like
love that.
I like where you're going with this one, Tommy. Keep going because I think I have some points on this one as well. I think this is great.
Yeah, because this is honestly why I love being in this space, because you always have to keep moving. Where let's say you only wrote Power Query in M. Well, not only would that be unnecessary, it would be a waste of time. Even if you were that perfect expert in Power Query in the code itself. And my skills have to adapt from being super technical, where again, there's only one person that could do SSRS, and that was the person who knew how to write it, right? And invaluable. But now, again, anyone can really touch that data. So we continue to adapt. I think if you looked at someone who was in the weeds 10 years ago with the ETL and building reports, and they saw what was there today, not that long ago, I think it's absolutely incredible that we're not comparing Azure, we're comparing in a sense, the base level tools. So that makes me think, okay, what's going to be in the next 2 years? So I don't know if that's where you're going.
This is one of the most exciting things that got me all in with Power BI right away, was changing a skill set. So when I came out of restaurants into the business realm, I was on the business side, right? I was working within an application, helping customers, do things, and then that interface was it. And I got bored, and that's where I started diving into SQL servers, right? And then had an opportunity to dive into the technical area. Became the guy who could write queries, develop SSRS reports, because I think like people not having access to data, right, forced you to be more selective, or they were still doing that stuff on the side in Access databases in Excel anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
You just didn't know about it.
They're still doing it. It's still happening.
Why I got so excited is because, and what we talk about a lot is, as BI professionals, Power BI has allowed us to be closer to the business.
Yes.
In solving problems
Yep.
and providing value so much faster than we were able to before.
Yep.
Right?
I agree with that.
Since we're talking about all of these different things, these were the same things I did in the past as a BI guy writing SQL queries.
Yep.
It just took a long time.
Yep. Exactly.
Right? If I was going to automate a process for data refresh, if I had to shape data, it was, I had to create stored procedures. I had to build the SSRS report. We had to stand up a SharePoint server, a reporting server, that people could access. And then once you have all that there, your fast was getting a report out, which is just a table of information in like 2 to 3 days.
Yep.
Whereas now you can not only engage with the business, we can iterate so much quicker, right? So it's like, hey, you said like we do the discovery. Here's the first rev. Is this the data that you want? Like if we're shaping it and we're filtering it, here's like kind of the interactions we can have. Then you get out in front of all of the little like, oh, you know what would be really good here? This column, this data, this data, this data. Oh, okay, great.
Yeah,
Like
we can pull that in.
right
Let me do it
in
with
the
you right now,
beginning,
live, build.
you're figuring out all of these like challenging things that slowed down a project or was like the next version of something. And the speed to value is why I think organizations have started to adopt Power BI faster and faster, because you're solving these problems faster and faster. Where the conversation for me goes is awesome, like even data marts and all that fill into like awesome, but there's a lot of this that scales, right? How do you build it larger? How do you enterprise it? Like we are going to go back to those same like standards of how do you build good processes, accurate data, repeatable reporting. That is where I like seeing the parity here from like old to new, but I also want to see from new to how do we scale into new enterprise, because these components that we're using are the same technologies. They're just being offered up in different services.
Yeah.
So there should be parity, and there should be a grow up story for all of the reporting and things that are getting created on a daily basis now.
And we're just seeing more and more of this stuff come to like, even building like there's like the data warehouse side of things. Data marts fits this story very well. I mean, Marcus' article doesn't really show that in his article, but like if you take the data flow and the data set area and turn it into the data mart, where you're in, even now you go to powerbi.com, say, hey, I want to go get data. It's pushing you to go to the data marts space and asking you to, it's basically, instead of doing a data flow, please we recommend you go look at and build out a data mart. And now you can build all your things in the cloud. So yeah, to me, this is like, there's so many good points here. Like the ability to commoditize this stuff, the ability to open this up for people, the speed in which to iterate. I mean, I remember Seth, you gave me some, like, I'm going to go to a story here for Seth. So Seth was early on when I met Seth and we were consulting at a firm together as consultants. Seth had a story around, he went into like a meeting, and the traditional mindset was, I have a report. It's going to take me a bit of time to adjust the visuals on the report canvas to make it new. So you had built a report, apparently, you had connected to some data, and then you ran into a meeting with executives and was like, hey, or someone, I don't remember who it was, but you ran into the meeting and you're like, here's the report. And they're like, oh, that's really cool. Okay, I don't really like that visual. Let's take some notes. Let's write down, okay, here's the changes we want. Let's change that to like, a line chart or a bar chart or whatever. The change was requested in the meeting.
It was
a pie chart.
100% executive show and tell of what we built.
Yep.
And one of the key executives wanted his pie chart back.
Yep. It's like, I don't like this, and we hate those things.
As the side conversation, right? So he turned his attention away from the screen and started talking to people about the value of the pie chart. And
exactly.
I'm like, well, I'll just change it. Like, so he didn't even see it, like the change. And then when you look back at the screen,
boom, different,
like blown away.
Pie chart,
right? How fast we could make the change.
But and to me, that was a great illustration of like what his traditional mindset was around BI was: write down the request, send it away, go build the SSRS report, come back to it, and then, after some mucking around with the tools, you now have the new solution. And you could do this on the fly with people. And I would do that with, in my area as well. I'd go to a meeting with Power BI report open and say, okay, here's my data. Here's a couple pages of information that I found. And they would ask questions. And I would be like, yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I can answer that with this visual. Let me make a new page. And we would stitch data together in the meeting together and like architect what their answer was. Yeah, okay, the reason that number is so high is because here's the breakdown of those components. And if I click this, we can see all these things. Okay, does that make more sense? Oh yeah, it does. So instead of having a meeting where we were asking a bunch of questions to go research more and come back with answers, we were answering the questions in the meeting right there. And I was real time building things for people to answer their questions. This was like huge. That to me was like,
Yeah.
whoa, like this is the kind of stuff that we want to be working on.
And not only that, I mean, every single report development build that we do, we actually do that phase where we
Yes.
literally call our first phase now the sandbox. And we say, we're going to be playing the sandbox. We're going to
I
have
think
the
it's good.
desktop open, because why have the normal report if they have questions so we can move things in real time? And that's been
Yes.
incremental towards the adoption. And I think just getting the right reports out there.
Rob Colley
Seth,
does a really good
yeah.
example around that example. What you just say there specifically, Tommy. Rob Colley talks about something. I was in one of his speaking engagements. He talked about the idea of like, okay, if we took a project and wrote 300 lines of code on that project, that was the amount of code or programming or Power Query or whatever you want to say, whatever that data, whatever that was, took me from raw data to the answer. That's what it was. But if you look how much time that actually took to get through that 300 lines of code, if you told someone, hey, I have the code completed, just type it out, he would be able to type it out, I don't know, half a day, 2 days, something short. But the project actually takes like months, like a lot of time to get done, because there's all of this like communicating and sharing things between people. And he made this point of, if you're working on data by yourself, the only person you have to communicate or express the value of what you're doing is yourself. You're in your internal conversing about how to get the solution done. As soon as you involve a broader team, you now have to have this huge conversational barrier between different departments or people or whatever, where it's hard to articulate what you want. And unless you're a data person, you're like, well, I need to know. This is why I think I use this technique of defining the insights and then and working my way down from there, doing like a sandbox activity. Let's look at the data. Let's just throw some stuff on the page. What works, what doesn't work. What do we like, what we don't like. I'm doing more of that sandboxing activity now to get people along so they can understand more about their data. And it to me, it feels like it speeds up the whole process.
I think we're talking a lot more about data now than technology and like what to present, which is
That's an
I think a
interesting
good
point.
thing. The love-hate I have with the current capabilities that we have, especially when you start to engage with more of the business, is we were talking about how fast we can change some things, and they see that, but then they think everything is like that, right?
Yeah.
So it's like you've got to navigate the conversation sometimes where it's like, well, no, sometimes things take quite a while depending on what you're asking for, right? Like,
Yeah.
or what you're asking for is 30 seconds, right? And they don't know the difference, right?
Yeah.
So like, hey, maybe that's a good thing, right? Because you can just throw in a whole bunch of the 30-second fixes, right? Where
Yeah.
it's an option or something with a really hard DAX measure you need to come up with.
Exactly right.
No, and yeah, one thing I really do need to say this, Seth, because you, I think, highlighted probably the number one change this is really ultimately done for all of us. Where back in the day, if you were doing SSIS, like that's what you did. Someone handed you, in a sense, a description of what you needed, and you were forced, in a sense, to be in the back room. But now, like our skills is not. It obviously the data and being able to do the transformations is still essential, but more than ever, we have to be able to talk to people and ask the right questions and smile and go through that, where we're getting more and more business facing, being able to get grow people's trust. You can't just be an IT person that is stuck in the back of the room making reports. That relationship, that dynamic is over because of
Yes and no, right? Like you're not going to have everybody on your BI team be that engaging force, right? You still need the folks on the back end that are just
Agreed.
love the back end, right? So I think we're definitely in that space, right, where we're traversing the chasm between business units and things, and I think it's a very interesting and different sort of career path for tech people, right? To really engage in that space, because I think that's also the most valuable space you can be in, because you start to solve business problems, right?
Yeah.
Like you start to understand business much more so than you would have if you just stayed in the tech space, because you have this film between you and the business. And typically that's the ticketing system, right? Or
Right.
you're just trying to develop requirements because you're thinking technical all the time and how you're going to implement something. But there's still definitely realms for all of the things we're talking about in major infrastructure. And just because the tool sets allow for business users or us to develop these things faster or quicker doesn't mean that these slower, more methodical and enterprise, level uh activities and needs still aren't there, or very applicable in the current, in the classic BI stack. They absolutely are.
I definitely want to go back to your point there, Tommy. Like in the SSIS days, I think what I perceived here was you had these individuals that were very focused on working on SSIS things. And to your point, Seth, earlier, way earlier, was like, I would spend 3 hours working through something, fixing it, getting it right, like using a separate tool, Visual Studio, to build these things. Because it took so long to build something, you weren't wanting to build the wrong thing.
Right.
Like you knew it took a long time to get stuff
the wrong
done.
thing was built.
And then you're like,
many
crap.
times over.
Yeah, we didn't have the right requirements. So you spend so much more time defining the requirements. And so what you were able to do is you were able to put that person in a box more and say, okay, here's the walls of what I need you to build. It's going to take you 2.5 hours or 3 hours or a day or 2 days to build this one little thing that now we can do in like a couple minutes or less, right?
Right.
So because that was so that the requirement was so hard for that standpoint, you needed to spend a lot more time to find, okay, these are the tables, here's where it comes from, we're going to data map all this stuff out. And I think what we see now is because it's a commodity to do data transformations to some degree, we get sloppy with it. The requirements are not nearly as refined as we need to have it, and we just say, oh yeah, it's easy, and you just start building stuff. And then that didn't work, fine, I'll iterate it on 3 or 4 times until I get it right. But you can afford that now, because in the same amount of time I can pump out 4 or 5 different types of design to see what works.
And honestly, I think it's actually been one of the worst or unintended consequences of this transformation, right? Where before, again, the data that a company saw was very targeted because of that effort. Now we're thrown with all these additional reports and all these additional data points. Why? Because we have it and we can connect to it. So I think users are getting more. I would actually say that there has been definitely a negative effect of everyone can create reports, and we're just as guilty too. And I know I'm just as guilty too. This is not, the business user's not doing it right. I create a lot of reports and I'm connected, putting a lot of columns together. And then you realize that you have to take steps back, because again, you're not really limited by hours to add another column. You can do those tests, but then you can also publish all these reports. So I think what's occurred is companies now have more data than they really need, in a sense, to really look at. Where
No,
now
I disagree. I still think
I don't think so.
I don't think so.
I think you're just more aware of all the reporting
I
needs
agree.
that the teams need.
Yes.
Right. Which is why we have conversations like we have, which is, okay, if all those report requests are now relying on you and your team, as opposed to them going off and building their own thing in Excel or Access or whatever the case may be, how do you streamline those into, what the types of reports, right? Is it just data access that you need?
Right.
Great. Report builder, right? Like fast, easy. Here's a table of information. I agree with Mike. I don't think, like, the volumes have always been there. They've just found different solutions.
And now you're able to store them now. Like before, I think there was a lot of data happening and you had to throw away a lot of it because you couldn't store it. It wasn't cheap enough, right? The value wasn't there. And so, I mean, I would definitely point to the companies need more data, if anything. The challenge, I think, becomes is sifting through the data and finding what is actually valuable. Now it's become a noise vacuum or a noise space, right? There's so much data. There's so many things to look at. How do you find root cause of why your sales are down? What really happened? And I think that's where it's going to take. And again, I'm going back here to an earlier point that we said earlier. The skills that we need to be doing are changing. The tools are making it easier for you to create and bring in data to look at it. But now you need a new skill set, or now we need to work on another skill set that says, okay, the volumes of data are increasing. How do we hone in on what's really impactful? Where's the key message in the data? And so now we're having to be much more around a crafter of a data story as opposed to just purely saying, oh, I'll just bring the data to this report and let people figure out their own thing. I think you have to be. I explain it to a lot of my customers, right? You can think of a Power BI data model as this really massive, wide table. And if we're not asking the right questions of the data, you're going to get these, you're going to have all this information and you're going to have tables of data outputting and no one's going to know what to do with it. They're going to be overwhelmed. There's going to be too much to look at. We can't point our finger on what is the cause. Why are sales down this year versus last year? Which category is dragging us down? And why did that category drag us down for whatever reason? More time needs to be spent on understanding and analyzing it, and from that massive table, finding the couple rows of data that are actually impactful and things that I can take action on. That's becoming, for me, the next harder conversation to have, and thinking through that more.
I'm gonna.
That was a long. That was a long breath in, Tommy.
Well,
okay, let's talk.
Oh yeah. Like, I think that I agree. Like, we're obviously more in control of the data, but if I still just think the more accessible it gets is not necessarily always a net new positive. Where the more people who can transform, build an app, build a report, that's always going to be good. I don't think that's it's a hundred. It's a let's say what am I trying to say?
It's
Yeah.
I flat out disagree with you. If you have a tool that allows people to create a report that in some way, shape, or form provides value to them in the business, then you're creating business value.
Correct.
No matter how jacked up that report is or how they got about the ETL, like the value to the business is there. And that's why I'm saying, like, that's what I'm excited about with the capabilities of democratizing BI is the value to the business is so much faster, higher, and better because you're enabling people to get data and do things with it to get better insights so they make better decisions for your business. We talk about these core components in infrastructure because those are added investments that the business can now say, yeah, we've got this view, but if we had this view, this would be a game changer for us. We're going to go invest a bunch more dollars into like that path because it makes sense for us to do versus in the past, they had no other choice. The only way you get any insight was to invest in that kind of infrastructure. Like, do I agree with you from the standpoint that there is a ton of noise out there, right? There's a lot of garbage in the ecosystem of people building horrible stuff from a proper modeling standpoint. Absolutely. Do we need paths and tools and ways to figure out and how to manage that? Absolutely. 100% agree with you. But to say that like because people can use these tools now, things are so much worse. Completely disagree.
And I'm not saying it's going to be worse. I'm just saying they're done. Like, am I saying that 100%? No. I think there should be at least a process to at least, and I'm not going to use the word govern, but to keep track of yourself. Again, if I had an unlimited budget, I'm going to spend unnecessarily on my groceries, right? Compared to if I had a finite budget where I'm like, why did I buy all this stuff? I think that's the same thing that's happening in the data story, where we also need to have that structure where I'm not going to build all these reports and all these apps just because I can. That's just going to lead, I think, to somewhat confusion. Why do we have 12 tables that are basically doing the same thing?
I agree, but to me that is a different problem, right? And it's one that we can talk about. How do we solve that problem? How do we manage better? How do we figure out what's most useful for the business as opposed to a one-off? Or if we have the same type of report that's doing the same thing over and over and we're wasting resources or capacity, that makes sense, right? Those are all challenges that we now have to face and figure out given the new ecosystem.
Right.
I mean, this was all happening before, except the difference was you were giving someone to get data, you're giving them access to data. Well, there's two things that were happening before. Either one, they had no access to data and they just couldn't see it. So that was option number one, which no one loves. Then the second option is people were asking for data, and what you were giving them was a reporting tool, business objects, something else, whatever. And what they were doing is they're in those tools. I had access to tools where I could build charts and visuals. I never did. All I did was go in there and make a very wide table and dump it out, and then do all of my data manipulation offline. So what you're seeing,
Right.
I think now is you're seeing the level of effort that people used to be doing in Excel or in offline systems, Access, whatever you want to call it. And now you're walking back and saying, okay, we can now expose that, and we're centralizing to some degree. We can identify across the business all of this activity that has just automatically been happening, but now it's being visible to us now. So now we can actually see who's making what. And again, because now we're trying to optimize on the compute layer of these things, we're no longer thinking through, the storage is cheap, compute is being more expensive. Before, when you bought all these computers and everyone's running their own Excel sheets, you have like almost unlimited compute on your company because everyone's bringing things down and computing on their local machine. Now that we're centralizing it into a cloud and we have to pay for all that on like a monthly basis, now what? Now how do you provide access to these things? And I think that's where I'm seeing like this, to me, I don't think you ever, my opinion here, this doesn't work in all business cases or all situations. There are certain things in the organization that are important enough that you centralize. But in the BI space, especially around Power BI, if you're bringing self-service things to people, there is no reason why you want to close that off for the broader part of the organization. You need to be building models and things and giving them access to data, explaining how it works. And you have to be educating the knowledge level of your company to leverage these models. Now, granted, everyone's not, like, I've always used the analogy of, for every one data modeler, there's like 5 or 10 report builders. And for every 5 or 10 report builders, it doubles again, or, it's like, 50 to 100 people who are going to consume the reports, right?
Right.
If you look at like a bullseye, right? The bullseye is the hardest thing to do is model the data so that it works in many different reports. And then from there, you have this report authoring sphere. And then even larger bubble is people who just need to see the data. I just want to look at it. That's it. So I think as you kind of grow that bubble out, it's the same thing you were doing with building multidimensional models or SQL servers or any other reporting solution. It's the same. You give metered access to certain things and you train people on how to use them so they can self-service. You're not one team, unless you're have a massive team, it's not going to be able to meet all the needs of the business. I don't think it's possible anymore.
So net, right? With great power comes great responsibility. And whether or not the business users know they have it, they do. And
True.
really, the difference between classic versus Power BI is the paradigm has shifted completely from no access to any data or any way to see it to create business value to the other pendulum, which is create business value as fast as possible, which is immensely valuable, 10 times much more so than waiting on and not being able to have access or see data. The challenges with that, though, are there are always costs. There is always infrastructure. There is always management. And that never changed,
Yeah.
which is where I think we come into the play and we have conversations all the time because this is a new world problem for us to solve because we have to solve it in different ways and still be able to track and say, well, this is more valuable than this. We need to cut costs here because this person over here is
very true.
Export, to Chris Wagner's earlier point, figured out that somebody posted how to, in a premium instance, refresh every second or something.
Yeah.
Right. Like, yeah, that's no, you don't need real time. Right. Stop killing our server. So these are different challenges, but that are just coming from a different direction as opposed to where they came from before, but are in no way, shape, or form am I trivializing that. I just think it's a much better shift where we can have conversations and create a lot more value faster than we used to be able to.
I agree with that.
And then go the other direction because business changes. There's a lot more people on this side that don't know the technical aspects of things. And we now have tool sets that allow them to create their own value. That's not a bad thing.
I don't think I want to think of it as a bad thing. I think I want to think of it as the paradigm is shifting, and we're now having to adapt, right? So our processes,
education,
yeah,
right? Like
education,
we
yes,
have to educate people then. Here's how you do these things, because what's happening here right now is this, where I think a lot of time your frustration comes from. What is happening is all of the hidden stuff that we never knew about or the company didn't is now coming into the light, right? Because we're trying to push Power BI. We're trying to have them use an ecosystem, and there is a lot of garbage that is just filling up that we as teams are going to need to have to solve at some point, right? Because there's going to be a tipping point where the business is like, well, wait a minute, we're spending X amount of dollars. Like, well, there's a reason for that, right? Like we have to educate our users. This is how they have to go. Like there's a technology behind all these things, right? And
So yeah.
it's a different way of viewing, I think, the same challenges we've been solving. It's just a completely different direction.
So I think that's a perfect way to end it, because it's the same thing that happened when Power BI came out. The common term was the Wild West. Like, man, this is wild. Where'd that report come from? Why is it on their workspace? Hey, that person left the company, and that report got deleted with them. What are we doing here? So I think, and part of what I love what we do is we're always kind of also planning for the future, where there's going to be more ability for people to access in new ways, making sure that we at least have the game plan and a vision for how that's going to work is going to be the most essential.
totally agree with that. I think my kind of final notes here on this one. So, Marcus, thank you very much for the great article. I love the fact that the architecture has changed here. I think what we're seeing here is a monumental shift into this low code, no code solutioning, where storage is cheap and we're now optimizing for compute. So I see a lot more. I mean, those are the trends that I'm seeing, whether it's a data warehouse, whether it's the Microsoft BI tools, whatever that looks like. Um, I also think that I'm observing, and again, based on this conversation, I think the gap is widening now. We're seeing the ability for these companies to pick up these more modern tools and increase the analytical gap between a company. So imagine a company that's still using SQL servers on-prem and doing everything through a slow method versus a company that can be more agile, prototype faster, do a bunch of things, and it you really like it changes how that business can compete. And so people will say it, but data is really an asset, I think. And I think we're seeing a shift here that if you don't compete in this space, you're going to get left behind because your company's not going to even have the skill sets to be able to use these newer tools. Anyways, that's my wrap up. Lots of thoughts there. Seth, yours?
It's a good one. We just keep getting longer rather than shorter.
I know. Wrap this sucker up. Anything for you, Seth?
I'm good.
Good.
I'm good.
You're like ditto. Ditto.
Love the direction. Love the direction. Different challenges for us to solve, but I think classic versus where we're at today. Engaging. Well, I think we're providing a lot more value as BI folks and Power BI people to the business than ever before.
Awesome.
It's exciting.
Well, for everyone who hung on for the full hour, we're trying to keep it to an hour. We're now over again. But thank you all very much who attended. We appreciate your time. Our only ask, if you like the podcast, is just share it with somebody else. Share it on social media. If there are any key nuggets here that you thought you liked, share it with a coworker. Talk to someone else about the podcast. Say, hey, you may want to check this thing out. Learning some interesting things here. So we appreciate it. All of your time here. Please share it. If you are not watching it online or the video, Tommy, where else can you find the podcast?
So if you are listening right now and you're like, man, why are they smiling and laughing so much? I have no idea what's going on. Join us live every Tuesday and Thursday, 7:30 a.m. Central. We have a great community, a great chat, some cool people that show up. If you are watching live right now, make sure to subscribe, leave us a rating, helps us out a ton.
Awesome. Well, thank you all very much. We'll see you next week.